presides over a mock trial on unwarranted searches and seizures. And that's our program schedule. Next, a talk about the shifting racial makeup of the United States and what it might mean for the country's future. Author Jared Taylor and columnist Samuel Francis spoke at a conference on race and immigration. A group called American Renaissance hosted this hour-and-a-half-long program. First, author Jared Taylor.
The subject of my talk is race and nation. And what I would like to talk to you about today is the demographic future of the United States, especially with respect to shifting racial makeup and what this will mean for the future of our country. Now, we've already heard something of the demographic projections, but just last March, the Census Bureau released its periodic projection of the ethnic makeup of the United States in the next few decades. And they reported that if current immigration rates and differential birth rates continue, that by the year 2050, the percentage of Hispanics in the United States will have increased from 10 to 25%, the percentage of Asians from 3 to 8%, and that of blacks to 12 to 14%. Now, all of these increases will have taken place at the expense of whites, who will see their percentage drop from 74% to about 50%. So it'll be within 54 years that whites will be on the brink of becoming just another racial minority. Now, because whites are having so few babies, they'll be an extremely old minority. Within just 34 years, whites will already be, at current trends, a minority of the population under age 18, and they will be 3/4 of the population over age 65. This will be just 34 years from now, well within the lifetimes of many people in this room. Now, as usual, the Census Bureau's projections, which they do from time to time, attracted scarcely any attention at all, but let us be frank, as some of the speakers already have pointed out to you, if this transformation takes place, it will be a veritable transformation of the United States of America. And the reason is that race matters. The racial transformation will be a transformation of many other things as well. Now, most of the time, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future, as Mark Twain used to say. But when it comes to this particular transformation, there are a number of things that we can say with complete confidence. And the reason is that to know what the future will bring, all we need to do is visit those parts of the country where the transformation has already taken place. For example, places like Miami, or Detroit, or Monterey Park, California. Now, the details, the specific details of what happens when the population shifts from white to non-white are very interesting, but let us just set them aside for a moment and consider a different, extremely important, profoundly important aspect. And this is something everyone knows but rarely says, and that is this, that once the number of non-whites reaches a certain level in an area, whites will not or cannot stay. They refuse to be a minority. They move away from those places where they have become minorities, and they seek solace in those places where they are once again a majority. This is an empirical, utterly dependable phenomenon, and it's a fact that everyone, and I mean everyone, knows this to be true, little though they may wish to talk about it. The process simply doesn't work the other way. Not even the most ardent integrationist is willing to take the most obvious step to make integration really come about. That is to say, to buy a house in a black neighborhood, or move into a Mexican neighborhood, or even for that matter, in many cases, send their children to public school. As far as whites are concerned, once a school or a part of a city has gone majority black or Hispanic, or even Asian in some cases, it might as well have disappeared from the map of their city. It becomes terra incognita, a little bit like those portions of ancient maps that used to say, here be dragons. What was once part of our nation and part of our civilization has slipped its leash. Therefore, one thing that we can say with complete certainty about the demographic change in the United States is that whites will withdraw from more and more parts of their country. It will, of course, be physically possible for whites to live with the Mexicans in Brownsville, Texas, or with blacks in Camden, New Jersey, but most will do just about everything possible to avoid it. Because the fact is, many of us can think of neighborhoods, of towns, of villages, places where we would like to live. And it's almost a certainty that if a white person is thinking of these places, they'll all have large white majorities. And by the same token, it would be difficult for any white person in the United States to name a single neighborhood or town in which you would wish to live that does not have a white majority. Now, much of the racial shift that the Census Bureau is predicting comes from third world immigration. Every year, as Dr. Lutton has explained to us already, we get about 800,000 legal immigrants to the United States, and we don't know how many illegals, 90% of whom are non-white. And immigration, of course, is not a force of nature. This is not a typhoon that we have no resistance to. This is a chosen policy that Congress could choose to unchoose. The United States has therefore, in effect, deliberately decided to make more and more parts of it, essentially, to put it rather provocatively and bluntly, off limits for whites. Now, you often hear that today's non-white immigrants are going to assimilate just the way the European ethnics did at the turn of the century. This view is hopelessly wrong because it avoids this painful question of race. Germans, Swedes, Irish, Polish, Jews, Italians, they all assimilated. Blacks and American Indians who have been here since colonial times, since far longer than many ethnic whites, many of them are still at the margins of society. Why is this? Well, the answer is clear. It's because race largely governs assimilation. Certainly, some non-whites fully embrace European civilization and European culture, but large numbers do not. And the question is really, why should they? It's entirely natural and normal that people embrace and love and cherish the culture and the way of life of their own people. Of course, part of today's orthodoxy is that when whites move out in the face of a changing population, it's because whites are uniquely racist. I'll return to this question in a moment, but in fact, people of other races are not all that keen in sharing their neighborhoods with people unlike themselves. There are now, in fact, plenty of places in the United States where there are large numbers of blacks and Hispanics and where whites play scarcely any role at all. For example, there are public schools in which there are practically no whites. Hispanics and blacks are the overwhelming majority, and they have race riots, they have racial rivalries in which whites play no part. At the same time, from Manhattan to Texas to California, well, there are high schools and junior high schools that are occasionally shut down because of these terrible, sometimes violent, black and Hispanic confrontations that are essentially racial rivalries that have nothing to do with whites. Likewise, at the same time, there are prison blocks in Texas and in California that are in a constant state of lockdown. That is to say, the inmates are kept forcibly in their cells and never allowed to go into public areas. And the reason is, whenever they are relieved from lockdown and when the prisoners are allowed to mix with each other, there are black and Hispanic race riots. They are at each other's throats immediately. Racial separation, which in fact the prisoners would be happy to have, and in fact which prisoners often demand, that would solve the problem, of course, but no one dares propose it. And as far as black and Hispanic relations are concerned, I was particularly interested to read the remarks of the president of a black homeowners association in southern Los Angeles when she was explaining why she didn't want Mexicans to move into her neighborhood. And as she put it to reporters, she said, it's a different culture, a different breed of people. They don't have the same values. You can't get together with them. It's like mixing oil and water. Well, I sympathize 100% with that black lady. And needless to say, and it may be mean-spirited to say this, back when those long-forgotten whites moved out, when blacks moved in, I think it's likely that they said similar things about blacks. What happens, on the other hand, when Asians arrive in large numbers? Well, the effect is more ambiguous. Some North Asians commit fewer crimes than whites. They do better in school, they make more money. On the other hand, there are other Asian groups, the Hmong of Cambodia, 60% of whom are on welfare. However, this is a point that I wish to emphasize. It doesn't matter if Chinese and Japanese build societies that are in some respects objectively superior to those built by Europeans. It matters only that they're different. When large numbers of North Asian immigrants moved into Monterey Park, California, this was a rather famous test case of a population changing into North Asians. Whites didn't leave Monterey Park because the newcomers were rioting or opening crack houses or mugging people. No. They moved out because Monterey Park, in countless ways, ceased to be the city that they were born in or that they had moved to. They didn't care that these North Asians probably had an average IQ of 105, that they were probably more law-abiding than the older population, that they probably were more responsible in many respects. The point is, whites saw their way of life melting away beneath their feet, and they moved away in the hope of finding it someplace else. Once again, it's really not the particulars that matter. It's unwelcome, irreversible racial change that people object to. I think one very significant sign of the times is that's what's happening on college campuses today. American young people have been reared in what is probably the most relentless and rigorous anti-racialist environment in the history of the world. They've been taught over and over and over again that everyone is beautiful, that distinctions do not matter, diversity is wonderful, race is trivial. And yet, what do they do when they arrive on campus? They sort themselves out very obviously according to race. They segregate themselves in social clubs, in ethnic dormitories, and in all kinds of student group activities that are defined by race. Race matters, and all the yelling that society can do about it doesn't change this. Well, what will this projected demographic change, what will it be like on the national level? Well, that's a little bit harder to say. It's not like predicting what will happen when a neighborhood or a school changes, because we haven't yet had a nation with a non-white majority. But a nation that still has a white majority has managed to pass laws and regulations already that, through affirmative action and quotas, discriminate against whites. Many non-whites have now genuinely convinced themselves that this is what equal treatment requires. I think that we can be sure that when non-whites become majority, if that happens, they will certainly think of other discriminatory measures that they will think equality and equal treatment requires. Besides that, what sort of foreign policy would a non-white America have? Nobody ever thinks about this. What would a non-white America do or not do with its nuclear weapons? What sort of government would we have? In the long term, I'm really not certain that a non-white America would even maintain democracy or the rule of law. Let's be frank about this. The record of non-white countries has not been encouraging in this respect. And even if our forms of government survive, what sort of fanciful readings of the Constitution is a Supreme Court with people like Lanny Guinier on it going to find? What sort of readings are they going to find in our Constitution? Well, I suspect that in a non-white America, the First Amendment would disappear just as the 10th Amendment has. And I suspect that dissent from racial orthodoxy would constitute a criminal offense and that it would be simply impossible to hold a meeting of this kind. But to return, if I may, to the present, there is not a drop of public sympathy for the whites who are being displaced today by non-whites. We're all supposed to feel, in fact, morally superior to these poor, bigoted boobs who escape to the suburbs when the neighborhood turns black or when Mexicans move in. But the fact of the matter is, it's only certain people who have to face that kind of choice. People with money, the best educated people, never even have to make a decision of that kind. In fact, as someone far cleverer than I once put it, The purpose of a college education in the United States today is to give you the right attitude towards minorities and the means to live as far away from them as possible. You're right to applaud, but I wish I could claim that witticism as my own. But this orthodoxy about racial integration has therefore developed its own set of utterly transparent hypocrisies. Just about every elected official in the United States, every talking head, every self-righteous editorial writer in the country has chanted this mantra of integration so many times that he can repeat it in his sleep. But where do these people live? And where do their children go to school? Whom do they invite to their dinner parties? Whom do they marry? And whom do they urge their children to marry? No, they don't actually go live and go to school and socialize with those marvelous black people and those marvelous Mexicans and Nigerians and Pakistanis. No, integration is a splendid thing. It is so splendid that they insist that others should enjoy its benefits while they forego them themselves. So this is the smelly little consensus that our elites have quietly arrived at. Namely, integration is our goal, but not for me or my friends or my children. And in fact, these self-righteous and college-educated, properly socialized folks have come up with a whole set of mental exercises for the working class people who don't have the money to send their children to private school and who don't live in exclusive suburbs. The first exercise, of course, is to believe that aliens and strangers, they're bearers of a very special gift. It's called diversity. We're not being displaced. We're being enriched. We're being strengthened. Of course, the idea that racial diversity is a strength is so obviously stupid that only very intelligent people could have come up with it. There's not one multiracial anything in the United States that doesn't suffer from racial friction of some kind. In fact, our country has established this huge, gigantic, clanking mechanism of EEO officers and racial watchdog groups and outreach committees and you name it, all of these mechanisms to regulate and try to control racial diversity, something that was supposed to be a great strength, but turns out to be exceedingly volatile and difficult and dangerous and has to be controlled and watched and supervised all the time. In fact, people are so exhausted by this alleged source of strength that they run away from it the first chance they get. And that's why every group in the United States that's not yet controlled by the United States government tends to be racially homogeneous. Private parties, families, clubs, churches. When people get out of the arena in which government makes the rules and are allowed to make their own rules, they go their separate ways. Nothing, therefore, could be more obvious. Diversity of race or tribe or language or religion, these are the main reasons that people all around the world are at each other's throats. Just pick up any newspaper and you'll see that diversity, at least in the same territory, is not a source of strength, it's a source of strife. Another rather hilarious idea is somehow that a diverse population is going to be a great advantage for business or world trade. Well, of course, 99.9% of the things that we buy have nothing whatsoever to do with ethnicity or race or religion. No one cares who made your shoes or who assembled your computer. At the same time, contrary to what this diversity myth would suggest, it doesn't take an Irishman to sell things to the Irish. The world's most successful exporting nations today are China, Korea, Taiwan, Japan. These places have never heard of diversity. The fact is, American companies and American CEOs are full of all this hot air blather about how their diverse workforce that looks like America is just going to whip everybody in sight. Well, they're being whipped in their own markets by companies with workforces that look like Yokohama. At the same time, people appear to be so dazed by this incomprehensible doctrine of diversity being strength that they don't seem to notice that it's apparently only whites who suffer from this strange paralysis of homogeneity and have to be gingered up all the time with doses of diversity. I mean, after all, no one is suggesting that Howard University, which is overwhelmingly black, should practice diversity by recruiting Hispanics and Asians. And no one is suggesting that Mexico should launch an immigration policy that will reduce Mexicans or Hispanics to a minority in a few decades. No one is suggesting that. But if diversity is good for America, if diversity is good for every college campus, why isn't it good for Howard University? And why isn't it good for Mexico or Korea or China? Let's be consistent here. Of course, if white Americans, especially poor white Americans, were pouring across the border into Mexico by the millions, demanding that their children be educated in English, insisting on welfare, demanding voting rights for aliens, celebrating the 4th of July rather than Cinco de Mayo, even talking about tearing down statues of Santa Anna, could anyone trick the Mexicans into thinking that this was cultural enrichment? No. The Mexicans have far more sense than that. They would recognize an invasion when they saw it. I think they'd open fire, for goodness sake. So this whole racial diversity issue, it's strictly a one-way street. Only whites, apparently, are ever expected to practice it or benefit from it. And then the ultimate insult is to ask whites to celebrate diversity. Well, what is this other than asking whites to celebrate their own capitulation, to rejoice in their dwindling number and their dwindling influence? And the amazing thing about it is the number of whites who seem to have been persuaded at least to go through the motion of doing this. It's an astonishing thing. And for just how long are we supposed to go on cheering our own dispossession? Until whites are 49% of the population, until they're 25% of the population? At that point, would it be legitimate for whites to say, well, gosh, maybe we don't like this? Or are we supposed to go on singing and dancing over our own graves until we disappear completely? Well, this same process of demographic change is going on in Europe, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. It's going on all around the world, and the racial picture is always the same. Whites have built successful, desirable societies. The most successful and desirable really in the history of the world. And desperate people from non-white societies want very, very badly to live in them. And they're willing to risk nearly everything, sometimes even life itself, to come benefit from these societies that whites have built. And it's perfectly natural that they should do so. They want a better life for themselves and for their children. But what it means is that whites face a unique crisis. Whites are only about 8% of the world's population. They're only having about 4% of the world's babies. And if they let non-whites continue to move into their countries, they'll simply be pushed aside. If whites do nothing, they'll be swept away, and no other racial group faces this prospect because the movement is always one way. Actually, of course, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, those places would face a similar crisis if they permitted themselves to be governed by the same liberal foolishness that we permit to govern us. There are millions of Bangladeshis, of Malays, of Iraqis who would love to move to Japan for exactly the same reasons why Mexicans want to move to the United States. The Japanese, of course, are having none of it. They have this quaint notion that they like Japan the way it is. They want it to stay Japanese. And they realize that a few million Bangladeshis later, Osaka would no longer be part of Japan. So to repeat, whites and North Asians build these successful societies that other races have not built. And that is why non-whites want to come. Nicaraguans and Haitians don't come to the United States out of this generous motive, eager to share the gifts of diversity with poor white people about to choke to death on their own homogeneity. No, they come because their societies don't work and they know that life would be better in the United States. Of course, if Europeans had turned the entire continent of North America into a giant pest hole, nobody'd want to come. And if nobody were coming, there'd be no reason to come up with all of these strange reasons why they had a right to come, or why whites were actually benefiting from being outnumbered and pushed aside by people unlike themselves. The same process, the same migratory dynamic is at work on a smaller scale. In the United States, it may be blunt to say this, but I don't see how it can be denied. Virtually every desirable place to live or work or go to school is desirable because whites made it that way. Non-whites want to enjoy the benefits that whites have made, and that is why it is always non-whites pushing their way into white institutions or white neighborhoods or white schools. And that's why all of these phony battles of exclusion or tolerance or justice or racism, they're always played out on white territory, and whites are always the defendants, always in the dock, always the ones being accused. The fact is, whites are simply not clamoring to get into Howard University or to live in South Central LA or move to Guatemala. But I can assure you that if there was something rare and wonderful and valuable in those places, and that the non-whites who were there had created those rare and valuable things, I can promise you they wouldn't want to let us in. Of course, the sad thing is that generally speaking, once non-whites have gotten their way and have moved in large numbers into these desirable white institutions and neighborhoods, those institutions and neighborhoods lose the very qualities that attracted them in the first place. Whites leave, and we're right back where we started. For the most part, blacks and third world immigrants recreate in their new locations very much a simulacrum of the places they left behind, with all the shortcomings that persuaded them to leave in the first place. Now, so far, although I've been perhaps more blunt and outspoken about it, I really haven't said anything that everyone in America at some level doesn't already know. No school or neighborhood is improved by going from white to black or Hispanic. And whites generally just don't stick around to see whether or not just this time, just this once, maybe water's going to run uphill. Well, what is the message of all of this white flight? What does it mean? It means, quite simply, that the deepest underlying assumptions about race that have directed American policies the last 30, 40, or 50 years, this deep assumption is wrong. The theory, and it's not always stated, but the theory is that if we work at it hard enough, if we just keep hammering away at it, we can build a society in which race can be made not to matter. Well, this was something that many people thought was a noble and idealistic thing. I give them credit for that. But it was based on a misreading of human nature. Race simply does matter. It is a brute biological fact, and wishing simply won't make it go away. The idea of trying to build a society where race can be made not to matter reminds me of a different idea that a lot of people thought was noble and idealistic and worth fighting for, and that also failed miserably. And that was the idea that people can be persuaded to live and work from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Communism, just like multiracialism, was based, I believe, on a catastrophic misreading of human nature. And communism staggered on for 75 years, just as our experiment in multiracialism has staggered on for 40 or 50 years, before communism finally foundered on the simple and utterly obvious fact that people tend their own private vegetable gardens a lot more carefully than they're willing to work on a collective farm. Well, of course, communism, because it was so much based on this misreading of human nature, it became something like a secular religion, just like the doctrine of the unimportance of race has become a secular religion. Both had their dogmas, their hysterical reactions to dissent, their astonishing ability to ignore obvious facts, the suppression of all disagreement, excommunication of heretics. And the most remarkable thing, though, was that although communism required an entire state apparatus to keep it going, in America, there is no state apparatus in that sense. Every man is his own commissar. Every person censors his own thoughts. And that's why, even when they're moving to the suburbs, even when they're pulling their children out of public school and paying after-tax dollars to send them to private schools, whites keep insisting that race has nothing to do with it. And I think many of them actually believe what they're saying. But this is what orthodoxy simply requires that they believe. Of course, an orthodoxy that goes against human nature can't survive. And this particular orthodoxy, I believe, will collapse eventually, just as communism did. And 2,000 years ago, the Roman poet Horace pointed out, as he said, "You may drive out nature with a pitchfork, but she will always return." And at some point, nature will reassert itself and whites will decide not to commit racial and cultural suicide. In the meantime, though, the really intriguing question is, why are whites letting this happen? Why do they do this? Why do they still pay lip service to this ideal of racial equivalence, of integration, race doesn't matter, when in their own lives, in their own decisions, they violate these doctrines all the time? Why are they, at the same time, ensuring that their children and their grandchildren will be racial minorities, very likely a disliked racial minority in their own country? Well, my answer to this question is admittedly speculative. But the reason, I believe, has to do with the perversion of something that is characteristic of whites and of Western civilization in general, and that is a sense of reciprocity, of morality. When one thinks of the unique characteristics of Western civilization, so many of them boil down to this rooted conviction that can be expressed in a very simple way, and that is that the other fella has a point of view. Take democracy, for example. It's based on what is really a truly heroic proposition that the other fellow not only has a point of view, but theoretically, it's just as likely to be right as my point of view. That's an extraordinary point of view for a society to assume. And the fact is, for the most part, only whites have been able to make democracy work. The rule of law, it's likewise based on the assumption that power, raw power, is not self-justifying, that the other fellow, even if he doesn't have power, still has a point of view. In fact, European culture and European mores are suffused with this notion. The ideals of sportsmanship, for example, they are designed to ensure fair play and to prevent humiliation of the loser. Freedom of speech and press, they ensure that the other fellow, with his point of view, has an opportunity to express his point of view. The elimination of hereditary class status, that ensured that the other fellow, with his own point of view and his own aspirations, can rise and fall on his own merits. It was Europeans and Americans who developed and perfected these ideas. In many cultures, they haven't even come close. The missionary impulse, for that matter, is a uniquely European and American impulse. It's fashionable, of course, to laugh at missionaries. But the fact is, they were motivated by a deep concern for the salvation of others. The other fellow not only had a point of view, he had a soul. He had an immortal soul that was in danger of damnation. And missionaries went through extraordinary hardship in order to save that soul. The role of women in Western societies. It also reflects the same assumption, except that in this case, it's the other sex that has a point of view. Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, and American Indians essentially treated women as beasts of burden. In Islamic societies, women were kept inside, and when they were actually let outside, you'd throw a blanket over their heads. In Japan, as a Japanese friend of mine once explained to me, the status of a woman lies somewhere between that of a man and a bird. Only in the West was the weaker sex actually elevated to a code of chivalry and gallantry. The other sex, just like the other fella, has a point of view. Let's take another consideration. This is concern for the environment or for wildlife. On this planet, concern for the environment is an almost exclusively white preoccupation. And this, in effect, is recognition that the other fellow who's not even yet born, the people in future generations, have a point of view that we must respect. Now, some would argue that environmentalism is simply a reflection of a society's wealth that permits this kind of preoccupation, and to some extent that is true. But what about the Japanese? They're as rich as we are, in some respects richer. But when it comes to wildlife, they don't care about saving whales, they want to eat whales. The same is true for the Hong Kong Chinese. Many of them are rich enough to buy and sell Donald Trump and say, keep the change. But they care more about their dose of rhino horn or their savory plate of bear paws than they do about the rhinoceros or the bear. Whites, therefore, in my view, take this notion of reciprocity and morality, if you will, to a quite unusual degree. Not only does the other fellow have a point of view, the other species has a point of view. Now, according to current racial orthodoxy, whites are far from being the way I've described them. They are uniquely evil and certainly not concerned about the other fellow's point of view. And of course, it is true. Whites have done a great deal of killing, particularly in this century. I believe, however, that the success and the scale of this killing merely reflects the technological genius of whites. Far more remarkable than the killings that whites have done, far more remarkable than the things whites have done, is the things that they did not do. Whites could have kept non-whites in slavery for an eternity if they'd wished to, but they freed slaves for moral reasons. For the same reasons, they forced non-white peoples all around the world to free their slaves. Whites had the power to colonize the entire world, but no, they dismantled their empires because those people had a legitimate point of view. Whites still have the power, if they wanted to run the entire planet on some kind of extraordinary exploitative fashion, but they don't. They simply don't. Now, this way of thinking, this notion that the other fellow has a point of view, has actually been perverted by current racial orthodoxy to the point that many whites think that not only do non-whites have a point of view, their point of view is always somehow superior than that of whites. And when faced with an explicitly racial demand from a non-white, whites are terrified and demoralized, and they have lost the argument before it gets even started. Robert Frost used to say that a liberal can be defined as someone who can't take his own side in an argument. Well, the same really is true for whites. They cannot or will not take their own side in any kind of racial discussion. In fact, many whites believe they're not even supposed to have a side. They're not even supposed to have a position. I think, therefore, that the reason whites are paralyzed in the face of national and cultural and racial dispossession is because they've convinced themselves that it would be simply immoral to resist. And I think that whites, to an unusual degree, have to be convinced that what they're doing is moral. It has to be right. Respect for the other fellow's point of view in this case requires that we do nothing in the face of our nation's possible transformation. And so it's the same impulse that makes whites save the snail darter or the ozone layer or to believe so fervently in democracy. It's the same impulse that, in a perverted way, prevents whites from acting in their own legitimate group interests. Now, whites, of course, reveal what they really think about race or immigration or the future of their country every time when they move and go to the suburbs. In their bones, I think most whites recognize that it would be a calamity if the United States begins to look and act precisely like those parts of the country where they personally refuse to live. I think that if, in most whites' mind, if the entire map of the United States becomes like these parts that say, "Here be dragons," they know that life will change. Whites are deeply, deeply pessimistic, and they're very much afraid of a non-white future for their children, but they dare not say so. They've convinced themselves that to speak would be immoral, and nothing could be worse than to open themselves to this charge of racism. In any case, I think that the moral question, which I think torments whites, can be put in rather dramatic terms in this fashion. Let us imagine that Mexico, in fact, invaded and conquered the southeastern part of the United States. Well, what would be the consequence? What would the Mexicans do with their new territory? Well, they'd establish Spanish as the official language, and they'd expel most of the white population, and Mexicans would live there, and they'd abolish American holidays and celebrate Mexican ones, and food and music and everything else. The texture of life would become Mexican rather than American. And of course, as I suggested earlier, that is exactly what has already happened in many parts of California and Texas. A similar immigration from Central America has accomplished precisely the same kind of transformation of Miami. In just 30 years, from 1960 to 1990, the white population of Miami went from 90% to 10%. In 30 years, 90% to 10%. If we wish to continue this analogy, the inner cities of our great metropolises have in effect been invaded and conquered by Liberia. Now, all of these places have lost their European American culture and even their nationality, and America is therefore giving up the very thing that nations go to war to preserve, the very thing that they send their young men into battle in order to keep. Why are they doing? Why is it, in fact, that nations are prepared to sacrifice sometimes millions of men in the face of invasion? It's because the preservation of the nation of their forefathers is more important than life itself. Well, obviously, it would be moral to stop an armed invasion from Mexico. Why is it wrong to resist an unarmed process that produces exactly the same results? Why is it wrong to take peaceful measures to forestall the catastrophe that nations wage all-out war to prevent? Well, before he was assassinated, Yitzhak Rabin explained that what mattered most to him as an Israeli Jew was that Israel remained 80% Jewish. Now, I never heard anyone call Mr. Rabin a bigot or a hate monger. But we know what will be said, what would be said, and what is always said about any white person who said that it was important that the United States remain at least 80% white. Well, the fact is the reasoning and the morality of an Israeli Jew in this respect and an American white are essentially identical. Israel will change in countless unacceptable ways if it ceases to be Jewish, just as America will change in countless unacceptable ways if it ceases to be white. Because the fact is, the forms of civility, the folkways, the demeanor and the texture of life that whites take for granted simply don't survive the embrace of large numbers of non-whites. The things that I love most about culture and human society simply haven't survived in Detroit and Miami. And that's why whites have left. I may be unusual in saying this, it may not be nice to say this, but that is why they've left. And interestingly enough, I think because of this strange perversion of morality, it's for fear that they will be thought not nice, that whites are prepared to leave to their grandchildren a third world nation. In fact, it's difficult for me to think of a greater act of collective cowardice and irresponsibility. In fact, Americans have known for hundreds of years that multiracialism of the kind that we are supposed to be practicing today would be disastrous. You may remember the American Colonization Society. This was a group of Americans who wanted to free blacks from slavery and persuade them to go voluntarily back to Africa. A list of some of its officers, and these were actual officers of the society, not mere supporters, reads like an honor roll of American history. People like James Madison, Andrew Jackson, Daniel Webster, Stephen Douglas, William Seward, Francis Scott Key, General Winfield Scott, two Chief Justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, John Marshall, Richard Taney. The Liberians went ahead and named their capital Monrovia because James Monroe had been such a help to them in establishing their colony. Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, they all favored colonization because they thought it was simply impossible to build a multiracial society of the kind that we are building. The intellectual antecedents, therefore, for racial disengagement, therefore, include many of the genuinely great men of our past. This suicidal fad of multiracialism is just a few decades old. Not one truly great American ever endorsed it. We're supposed to believe that, well, yes, Lincoln and Jefferson, they were great men, all right. So was John Marshall. So was James Madison, Andrew Jackson. But when it came to race, they all got it wrong. Well, who got it right? Ted Kennedy? Bill Clinton? This is a joke. To conclude, I'm certain that my ancestors, the Americans of the past, they did not fight for independence from Britain in order for our generation to hand the country over to Mexicans and Haitians. I am certain of this. The founders didn't frame the Constitution to celebrate diversity, and Americans didn't shed their blood at Gettysburg in Europe and in the Pacific for multiculturalism. And yet, the rightful heirs to what could be a shining beacon of Western civilization are today giving up their nation and their birthright practically without a struggle. What we're witnessing is, I think, one of the great tragedies in human history. We have set powerful forces in motion that, if left unchecked, will slowly push aside European man and European culture and then dance a victory jig on their collective grave. If we do nothing, the nation that we leave to our children and grandchildren will be a desolated third world nation where they will be a minority, and Western civilization will be a faint echo and vilified even if it's audible. I cannot think of a tragedy that is at once so great, so unnatural, and so unnecessary. Thank you. Thank you very much. I've got 15 minutes here. If you have any questions. Yes, sir. Professor Hart.
This is, it's not a question.
Yes.
I just want to say I've heard you speak several times, and you were always good. But this speech is the best you've ever made. It was really marvelous.
Well, gosh. I don't believe I will repeat that for the cameras. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Mr. Taylor, as someone who speaks Japanese and is familiar with that culture, can you give us some indication? Do they not see, obviously, through different terms, different values, what we're talking about here? Is it the same inhibition in Japan in talking about the American racial catastrophe that we have here?
The question was whether or not in Japan, a nation with which I happen to be quite familiar, are there the same inhibitions about discussing race, and are they aware of the kind of catastrophe that we're building for ourselves? No, in fact, Japanese, I could regale you for an hour, in fact, with tales about the Japanese and their views on race. By American standards, Japanese are just touchingly race conscious. They're innocently, naively conscious of race. I remember I worked for a bank for a while in New York City, and one of our big customers, the treasurer of the company changed, and the new one came from Japan, and they had some sort of foul up, and the man who was going to get him at the airport couldn't, and I went to get him, because it's when you serve your customers that they do business with you. Well, I picked this man up at the airport. I took a bit of a wrong turn coming in from JFK, and we went through some pretty divey neighborhoods, and this guy, this is his first visit to the United States, he kept looking around. Where are the Americans? Where are the Americans? A perfectly typical Japanese reaction. I had to tell him, well, these people are Americans. On another occasion, when I still work quite frequently with Japanese consulting clients, and when the bell curve came out, I just got a copy, and whenever I had a break, my clients found me reading this great fat, thick book, and they wanted to, I was absorbed in this thing. Well, what's this about? And I said, I explained, it's Zaberukov. Oh, yeah, they'd heard of this book. They'd had no idea what it was about. And so I sat several of them down, and they said, well, what's all the whooping about? And as you all probably know, the book is mainly about the importance of intelligence. It has very, very little to do with race, and I was talking about this, and I also explained some of the racial business. And I tried to go into fair detail and explain it to them in a way that they'd understand, and after I'd talked for about, must have been 5 or 6, 10 minutes, one of them interrupted me and said, that's obvious, everybody knows that. So what was this great controversial bestseller in the United States is almost common sense and taken for granted in Japan. Now, I think that what's more important than these funny little stories that I could tell you about the Japanese is the consequence that this thinking has on their sense of peoplehood and their sense of being a nation. They are, of course, blessed in being an island nation, and they are not going to be subject to large waves of immigration. But I think even if they were not an island nation, it's this almost, as I say, almost touchingly naive, almost childlike sense of racial difference that will preserve them. And so despite the fact that they are a rocky island nation with only the size, the land mass of California, with half of our population, fully half of it shoved into California, can you imagine that? I think in many respects their future is rosier than ours because of this very clear sense of Japanese peoplehood. That was a long answer. Yes, sir, in the back.
Jared, do you consider Louis Farrakhan's black nationalist rhetoric just that, or do you think it's
You know, that's a very interesting question. I certainly applaud black nationalist self-help. I think one of the greatest things that Louis Farrakhan does for black people is tell them, you got to do it on your own. I mean, his position, of course, is Whitey is never going to help you. I think Whitey, for the most part, is happy to help, but his view is you've got to do it on your own. I think that is a profoundly important message for black people as it is for anybody else in the world. And so I salute Louis Farrakhan for that. One thing that Farrakhan has talked about for years, and if you ever see his publication, The Final Call, in the next to the last page, there is a platform of the Nation of Islam, what we believe, what we stand for. And did this suddenly go out? In any case, one of the parts of the platform is separation. He says that the children of the slave masters and the children of the slaves, we've been trying to get along for 400 years. It's not worked. It's like a marriage that's gone wrong. We need a divorce, separation. Well, I thought it was very curious that when he had the Million Man March, and all the world's cameras were on Louis Farrakhan for an hour and a half or 2 hours, I can't remember how long the speech was, when he had the largest audience he's ever had in his life, he never talked about separation. Now, I'm not close to the Nation of Islam. I'd like to know more about it, frankly, but I'm beginning to wonder whether or not he himself no longer believes this. I think perhaps he and some of the people in his movement have concluded that separation would not work, that in some sense they know that an all-black America or an all-black republic in America would not be successful, and so they would prefer to be in a white majority nation and yet exert the kind of racially intimidation and racial power that they exert because of this capitulation of whites. But to repeat to the original to get back to the original point, I think in terms of self-help, self-reliance, in all of those respects, what the Nation of Islam stands for is a very, very good thing. Any more? Let's see, way in the back in blue. Oh, yes, sir, Professor Rako. The question was, after all, we have differential birth rates in the United States such that non-whites are having more babies and actually at younger ages and shorter generations than whites. And even if immigration were stopped off, cut to zero tomorrow, would that not still be a process that would result in whites being reduced to minority? And therefore, should one not simply encourage white immigration rather than cutting off all immigration? Well, I think having a white immigration policy, it's not something that I would object to. After all, Australia had a white Australia immigration policy until 1974. It's only at that point that they capitulated. The problem, of course, is where are these white people going to come from? In effect, we would be importing the loss of Europe or the loss of Australia. And so, in a sense, our gain is someone else's loss. I think we have to think in terms of the world picture for our little world racial minority. The whole question of differential birth rates is a vexing one. I think that, in a way, part of it could be solved simply by getting rid of welfare. Welfare is a system, of course, in which the competent, responsible members of society are taxed and forced to subsidize the proliferation of people who are incompetent and irresponsible. In a way, it's a kind of a massive cuckolding, if you will. People are forced to rear the offspring of people not their own. And I think that there's no question that this has added to racial differential birth rates. However, I don't really have a good answer to the question of what one does about differential birth rates. Although, as I say, I think eliminating welfare would be a huge step in the right direction. Yes, ma'am.
I've heard talk of concern among the men here of the feminist movement and how it has discouraged the best and the brightest of the white women from having children. Could you speak to that a little?
Well, there are others in this room who have spoken more thoughtfully and eloquently on that subject. I think that it certainly is a problem. I think that feminism is, if you will, yet another perversion of one of these aspects of Western civilization. The kind of high status that women have had in Europe. I mean, after all, Tacitus noticed this, was it 1,000 years ago, that the Germanic tribes had this remarkably high position for women. I think unquestionably the idea that just as races are indistinguishable and equivalent, the sexes are indistinguishable and equivalent for professional purposes, for all motivational, personality purposes. I think it is a preposterous nonsense, but one of the very important one of the very important consequences is, as you've said, that some of the most intelligent and ambitious white women are going off in careers, not having children, and I think that many of them are in fact discovering once they turn 35, once they turn 40, that they have made a dreadful mistake. In fact, I was a member of the first class of Yale that admitted women. And so when I graduated from Yale, I graduated with this group of women who were probably the most sought after lady high school students in the entire history of the United States. They were courted and wooed. There was only a small number of them. All of them charged off into these great careers. I'm still in touch with quite a few of them. And I can't tell you how unhappy and bitter some of them are at the fact that they have no children, they have no families. They feel, in many respects, that they were sold a bill of goods. And I think in many respects they were. This is all, I think, yet again, another perversion of something that has been good and wonderful and characteristic of Western civilization. Yes, sir.
To ask a question moves the conversation somewhat from the polite conversation in the living room to the more, let's say, devastating room of the bedroom. You talk about white flight, but the issue of interracial marriages is something that I don't know what the statistics are. I live in New York City and Washington. I'm just stunned all the time by the amount of interracial dating and marriages that seem to go on the young kids today. You see it as the main topic on talk show TV, on talk show radio. You see videos by Madonna. You see movies being made. It seems like the white family may move to the suburb, but their daughter ends up dating a black man. I can tell you that Washington, every other white woman, it seemed to me, was dating an Iranian, an Arab, a black man. Maybe I'm just exaggerating in my own observations, but do you see that as a serious problem? Do you see that perhaps a mechanism would operate like it has in South American countries to hybridize the population?
The question had to do with interracial dating, interracial marriage, and how frequent it is, and just to what extent that's a problem for the survival of whites as a distinct racial group. I remember reading statistics somewhere that approximately 3% of marriages in which whites take part are interracial. I know that among ethnic Japanese in the United States, more than half of all ethnic Japanese marry outside their race almost exclusively among whites. Sure, there's more than one way for a species or a subspecies to go extinct. I think that as far as interracial marriage is concerned, I myself can't work up a whole lot of personal outrage over individuals who decide to marry across racial lines. On the other hand, I think this is an unnatural thing that is trumpeted by the media. It's whooped up at every opportunity. And yes, you're right that the white couple may escape the suburbs, but their daughter may end up dating or marrying a black or an Iranian. I think in the long term, yes, it's a serious threat, and of course the problem is that we're not in a position publicly to denounce it, and in fact the public organs in the United States are constantly promoting it. As you may recall, I believe it was, when was that Supreme Court ruling that struck down all the anti-miscegenation laws? There were 24 states in the Union that had anti-miscegenation laws, and I think they were on the books until the 1960s. And they were not, excuse me? 1967. And I think that that's an interesting statement. These were laws that were passed by majorities of legislators, and they were not repealed by a majority of legislators. As usual in the United States, these laws were struck down by the tyrannical whimsy of Supreme Court justices rather than reflecting the majority position. I think that in a healthy racially conscious society, it's not inconceivable that there be anti-miscegenation laws. Yes, sir.
Wouldn't abolition of the government schools largely reduce this problem along with the restoration of the First Amendment, your right as a parent or a teacher or religious leader to speak against interracial marriage?
I beg your pardon? I didn't quite understand your question.
Wouldn't the abolition of the government schools be a benefit to the opposition to interracial marriage?
The question is whether or not abolition of government schools would make it easier to be opposed to interracial marriage. Well, I think abolition of government, most anything, would be a great boon to all Americans. At the same time, I think that in some respects, more important than the existence or non-existence of government schools is this constant whooping in the media about race and about interracial marriage. And what's to be done about that, I'm really not sure. In any case, I'm sorry, I see hands still up, but my allotted time has come to an end. And so I would like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is a gentleman with which many of you are familiar. Samuel Francis. He probably, among all the syndicated columnists in the country, writes most incisively and uncompromisingly about race and American culture. He marshals his arguments so brilliantly that Patrick Buchanan calls him the Clausewitz of the right. Even the New Republic has acknowledged that Dr. Francis is, as they put it, a guru of the old right. Now, Sam Francis has paid a very high price, as many of you know, for his outspokenness in what I think is an absolutely chilling commentary on the bounds of free speech in this country today. Last year, the Washington Times fired him as a columnist and as an editorial writer, and it was clear that it was because of his outspoken views about race. Aside from that, one of the great ironies is Dr. Francis had won the highest honors, journalism honors, of anyone on the entire staff of the Washington Times. Twice he has won the Distinguished Writing Award from the American Society of Newspaper Editors. In addition to this, he is the author of Beautiful Losers, which is a collection of essays on the failure of American conservatism. He also writes a very, very highly regarded column in Chronicles magazine and is a frequent contributor to Southern Partisan. And Dr. Francis will today speak to us on Equality Unmasked. Please welcome Dr. Francis.
Thank you very much. A good deal of water has gone under the bridge since the first American Renaissance Conference met in Atlanta in 1994. At that time, neither the bell curve nor Professor Rushton's work on race, evolution, and behavior had been published, nor even the rather less immortal contributions of the learned D'Souza. I felt then, in the aftermath of the Atlanta conference, and when these books were published the following fall, rather optimistic about the progress being made by those who sought a reevaluation of the role of race. But I have to say that today, my optimism is considerably more muted. The bitterly hostile reaction to the bell curve and Professor Rushton's work, the dishonest and cowardly treatment of the American Renaissance Conference in D'Souza's book, the crusade mounted in the press against this conference, similar crusades against talk show host Bob Grant in New York, and against other scientists who write about race. The difficulty that both Professor Levin and apparently Arthur Jensen are experiencing in finding publishers for their own major new works. And finally, but by no means least, the late unpleasantness that I experienced at the Washington Times, all lead me to believe that we, or certainly I, had seriously underestimated the resistance that frank and serious discussion of race would encounter. I have a little more to tell you about race, and certainly less than what Professor Rushton and Professor Levin and the other speakers here today and tomorrow can tell you. So what I'm going to talk about today is this very resistance that we encounter, why it exists and why it seems to be so powerful, and perhaps how we can meet and help overcome it. I'm going to start off with an account of the systematic harassment of two of our speakers today and tomorrow, Professor Rushton and Professor Levin. And I choose them for several reasons. Partly because they are present and can comment or criticize on my account as they see fit. Partly because their stories offer instructive lessons for the conclusions that I'm going to draw. And partly because both of them have displayed a great amount of courage and commitment to their beliefs and scientific findings. And I think it is advisable that this audience appreciate what some of us have to go through in order to provide you with the edification and entertainment of the weekend. My account of their experiences is largely drawn from Roger Pearson's book, Race, Intelligence, and Bias in Academe, which is a study of how various academics and scientists who have violated taboos about race have been systematically harassed by the political left over the last 20 years or so. But I'm going to end up with an account of the ongoing vilification of this conference in the press, especially in the local newspaper, the Louisville Courier-Journal, and show how that campaign has been organized. Finally, I will try to draw some conclusions about why these crusades are effective and how they can be resisted and overcome. In the Rushton case, Professor Rushton's problems began soon after he delivered a paper at the convention of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in San Francisco in January of 1989. His paper, as I understand it, was a précis of the research on racial differences that he later published and will discuss in remarks this evening. And it immediately generated attacks in the Canadian media. Professor Rushton, I should say, as most of you know, is a professor at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. The Toronto Star reported in a headline soon after his speech that a Canadian professor's study stirs uproar at conference, which was a rather exaggerated account of the reaction to the remarks. And 2 days later, the same paper carried a story headlined, "Theory Racist, Prof has Scholars Boiling." This kind of news coverage, and much worse, continued for some months and was characterized by reporters seeking to elicit statements of condemnation of Rushton or his address from his colleagues or from officials of the AAAS, and by soliciting reactions from various leftist groups in Canada and on the Western Ontario campus. Rushton's own efforts to debate or explain his theory further on television were seemingly not very helpful, since the debate format was usually stacked against him and dwelt on the political, rather the supposed political, rather than the actual scientific meaning of his theory. And on one occasion, he was greeted with a hostile and jeering audience of some 2,000. By early February, the mayor of London, Ontario, had formed a committee to investigate Rushton and his theories to determine whether they violated Canadian law. As many of you perhaps know, Canadian democracy enjoys a law known as the Race Relations Act that criminalizes anyone who willfully promotes hatred against any identifiable group and subjects such criminals to a maximum sentence of 2 years in prison. At first, apparently, the major demand was that Rushton simply be dismissed from his teaching position. And only later in March did the Attorney General of Ontario, dedicated to bringing dangerous criminals to justice, order a police investigation of Professor Rushton. The police forces of Ontario and Toronto formed a joint special force on pornography and hate literature that was supposed to interview Rushton and some of his academic supervisors at the university for the purpose of discovering whether he had violated the law. The investigation took 6 months and eventually concluded that while he had not violated the law, quote, "It is the overwhelming opinion of academics questioned that in many cases your conclusions have been drawn on misinterpreted and or questionable data. This has resulted in your presentation to the AAAS falling noticeably short of expected professional standards," unquote. Apparently in Canada, it is the province of the police to reach conclusions on matters of scientific interest. The audience, which by now perhaps suspects that there is a dangerous criminal in our midst, will no doubt be relieved to learn that the Attorney General of Ontario then held a press conference at which he graciously announced that Rushton was, quote, loony but not criminal. Yet at the same time the press campaign and the police investigation were going on, university authorities on Rushton's own campus also chimed in with denunciations of his ideas. The Dean of Social Science at the university published a letter in the university newspaper in which she attacked Rushton's theory. And in July 1989, he was given an unsatisfactory rating on his performance evaluation by his department chairman and denied a usually routine pay increase. Under university rules, teachers who receive such evaluations 3 times in a row can be dismissed from their jobs. Now, the fact is that Professor Rushton holds 2 doctorates, was the author of 5 books and more than 100 articles in scholarly journals, and held a Guggenheim Fellowship. Rushton appealed the evaluation to the dean's office and asked that the dean recuse herself because she had already published her views of Rushton. She refused to recuse herself, and her office upheld the department chairman's evaluation. Rushton then appealed the evaluation through a university grievance procedure, and arguing on the basis of his credentials, and also that during the 3 years for which he was evaluated, he had published 30 articles in 2 books and received the Guggenheim, he finally won a reversal of the negative evaluation. When Rushton returned to teaching in 1990, local agitators threatened to disrupt his classes to prevent him from teaching, and the dean ordered that he not be permitted to teach his classes in person. He was supposed to make videotapes of his lectures, and students were supposed to listen to them in a private room in which he could not be present. Questions were to be called in by phone. Rushton again appealed this ruling and won, but the dean appealed the decision. Eventually, the department decided to ignore the dean's ruling and return Rushton to teaching his classes in person. In 1991, Rushton's classes were disrupted on at least 3 occasions by protesters, and he was physically attacked on one such occasion. As I understand it, going to the hospital, being sent to the hospital with chest pains. Despite warnings from the university that it would prosecute disruptors, that had not been done by the spring of 1991, and student protesters, mainly made up of African or Caribbean students or New Left elements, continued to disrupt his classes and the university, and on one occasion in March 1991, actually disrupted the provincial parliament. I'm sure Professor Rushton has enjoyed similar adventures in recent years, but my information about them ends in 1991. Professor Levin's experiences at the City College of New York resemble those of Professor Rushton. Levin's original crime against humanity consisted of publishing a letter in the New York Times in 1988 arguing that shopkeepers had the right not to open their doors to black males if they feared robbery. The publication of such shocking opinions apparently mobilized cadres of student leftists to break down the door of the university president in protest. The president responded to this by admitting that the students did have the right to picket Levin's classes, but considerately provided Professor Levin with a bodyguard. The group known as the International Committee Against Racism, or INCAR, which is a Maoist communist group, circulated Levin's letter to the Times on campus. But the controversy was further excited by an article Levin published in an Australian magazine called Quadrant, in which he apparently argued that the decline of American education was in part due to the rise of radical feminism and to affirmative action and its promotion of lower IQ black students. The reaction against this article came mainly from the faculty rather than from student activists. And in October 1988, the Faculty Senate voted to condemn Levin's article as racist and as lacking cogency or empirical support. What the New York Police Department had to say about it, we don't know. But Levin was given only 3 hours' notice that the censure was to be considered and was not able to be present at the debate. Soon afterwards, the university president, who presumably by this time had gotten his door fixed, issued a letter commending the faculty for their intrepid denunciation of racism and beamed that he had been, quote, a proud witness to the discussion and debate, and that the resolution reflected the university's commitment to equality. This was followed by Levin's being told by the Dean of Humanities and the Philosophy Department chairman that Levin should voluntarily withdraw from teaching his introductory philosophy course. And if he did not voluntarily withdraw, the chairman would come to the first class and invite the students to transfer to another section. Believing this arrangement to be temporary, Levin agreed to the proposal, but he later learned that it was intended to be permanent and would be extended to any required course that Levin taught. This kind of restriction severely limits a teacher's ability to recruit students for advanced work, and it represented a long-term threat to Levin's academic career. Meanwhile, plans for the Inquisition proceeded briskly, with the president of the university writing a letter urging the faculty senate to form a committee to investigate faculty members for bias-related activities. The Senate refused to do so on the lucid grounds that such a committee would have a chilling effect on academic freedom, if not on their own careers. But the president continued to badger for such a committee, and in several interviews he expressed frustration that he was unable to break Levin's tenure and fire him altogether. Levin, meanwhile, continued to commit yet more crimes against humanity. When the American Philosophical Association concluded that blacks were underrepresented in teaching philosophy, Levin published a letter in the Proceedings of the APA arguing that the reason had to do with lower black IQ. This led the humanities dean at the school to send a letter to each of Levin's students warning them that their professor harbored what the dean called controversial views about race and sex, and offering them an alternative section if they were unable to cope with the trauma of being exposed to controversy in the course of studying philosophy. Finally, the president got down to business by forming a committee to inquire into whether Levin had engaged in conduct unbecoming a faculty member, a phrase usually associated with efforts to break tenure and dismiss the faculty member. 3 of the 7 members of the committee had earlier signed a petition stating that Levin was unfit to teach, and one would think that the conclusion of the committee was more or less foregone. In March 1990, a mob invaded Levin's classroom, earning the praise of the president for its restraint. In the event, however, the Inquisition against Levin did not succeed, in part because he eventually took successful legal action against the president and the humanities dean, as had Rushton against the Toronto Star. But as Roger Pearson comments in his conclusion about the Levin case, in many ways the most revealing and disappointing aspect of the Levin affair was the complete failure of his colleagues or the media which covered it to discuss the validity of Levin's views. At no point did any newspaper publish the relevant IQ data or invite competent psychometrists to comment on it. The head of the psychology department refused Levin's invitation to debate his claims by attacking his academic freedom and defining battle lines along academic freedom lines. Academic egalitarians once again managed to obscure the real core of the issue. Now, there is a common pattern in both of these cases, and I think in several others, that needs to be called attention to. What happens when an academic violates a taboo on race is that first the media broadcast and typically misrepresent it, and then the professional left, usually on campus, either racial minorities who feel aggrieved or white Marxists, moves into battle by invading classrooms, staging protests, prayer vigils, disruptions, demonstrations, and all the rest of it. But for the most part, even though that phase of the attack is the most visible and the most publicized, it is not the heart of the academic criminal's problems. The heart of his problem comes from a lack of sufficient support from his colleagues and supervisors or from their active hostility. Derogatory and dismissive comments on the academic's ideas can serve to harm his career and professional stature. Disciplinary action by chairmen, deans, committees, and university presidents can actually cost him his job or at least disrupt and subvert his academic work. It makes sense for Marxists and even minority students to be offended at ideas they regard as racist, and even up to a point to protest such ideas. And again, up to a point, that is their right. What makes far less sense is for professional academics and academic administrators to involve themselves in the controversies against the academic taboo breaker and to devote so much of their energies to punishing or silencing him. And what that pattern as well as the general hysteria that informs the reaction to any violation of taboos concerning racial equality, point to, in my opinion, is that what we are dealing with in egalitarianism today is not a rational belief. What we are dealing with in egalitarianism is an ideology that serves various social and political and even psychological functions. In fact, egalitarianism, since the progressive era of the early 20th century, and especially since the New Deal, has become at first an unofficial and increasingly an official ideology of the system in which we live. The government, the dominant culture, and even the economy of the United States and the Western world. Egalitarianism has become an ideology that protects, serves, and rationalizes the interests of the elites that hold power in Western society, just as doctrines like the divine right of kings serve the interests of monarchies and aristocracies before the French Revolution. Roger Pearson points to this role of egalitarianism in his chapter on the Rushton case when he writes, Rushton's research had carried him into an area of direct economic and political significance. His findings had uncovered flaws in the established version of environmentalist social science testimony on which massive government programs had been built in both Canada and the USA. These not only provided for a massive redistribution of wealth and reverse discrimination in employment, but had provided a vested interest for millions of beneficiaries. His findings also threatened the well-being of organizations that had been built on the surplus funds, which could be culled from supervising this redistribution of wealth, and also had potentially adverse implications for the immigration industry. Little did Rushton realize that his seemingly innocent research would stir up such a tempest. Those on the left knew the crucial importance of the data he was studying and of the need to keep the public from accepting his opinions, as well as preventing other scholars from daring to speak their minds on the issues involved. I think that understanding egalitarianism as the ideology of an elite is important for several reasons. In the first place, it puts the Marxists and radicals of the left in an entirely different light from the one in which they like to present themselves, that of rebels against the system. Invariably, when Marxist groups protest against racism, they argue that racism is the tool of capitalism, that a capitalist ruling class promotes racism in order to justify the exploitation of non-whites and to keep white and non-white proletariats divided. But in reality, there's no truth whatsoever in this theory. If it were true, we would expect academics like Rushton and Levin, Arthur Jensen and Richard Herrenstein to have received millions in grants from large corporations and foundations. In fact, they receive little or nothing. And the grants those institutions do make do not support hereditarian views of social problems, but rather environmentalist and egalitarian views. It was, after all, the Carnegie Foundation that provided Gunnar Myrdal with $300,000 to produce An American Dilemma, for years the Bible of racial egalitarian environmentalism. The truth is that when Marxists and self-described radicals denounce what they call racism, they are in fact performing as the ideological vanguard of the real elites that hold power and which possess enormous vested interests in egalitarianism and environmentalism. It is the radical egalitarians and anti-hereditarians who are the real running dogs of the system, and not those who challenge egalitarianism and environmentalism. And it is the hereditarians like Rushton and Levin who are the real radicals or even revolutionaries who challenge the lies and mythologies in which entrenched powers always mask themselves. In the second place, understanding egalitarianism as the ideology of the system and the elites that run it ought to alter our view of how the system and its elites actually operate. Most elites in history have always had a vested interest in preserving the societies they rule, and that is why most elites have been conservative. The British aristocracy up to the 20th century is a fairly typical example of such a conservative elite. But the elite that has come to power in the United States and the Western world in this century actually has a vested interest in managing and manipulating social change, the destruction of the society it rules. Political analyst Kevin Phillips pointed this out in his 1975 book, Mediocrity, which is a study of the emergence of what he calls the new knowledge elite, the members of which approach society from a new vantage point. Change does not threaten the affluent intelligentsia of the post-industrial society the way it threatened the landowners and industrialists of the New Deal. On the contrary, change is as essential to the knowledge sector as inventory turnover is to a merchant or a manufacturer. Change keeps up demand for the product, research, news, theory, and technology. Post-industrialism, a knowledge elite, and accelerated social change appear to go hand in hand. The new knowledge elite does not preserve and protect existing traditions and institutions. On the contrary, far more than previous new classes, the knowledge elite has sought to modify or replace traditional institutions with new relationships and power centers. And egalitarianism and environmentalism serve this need to create and manage social change perfectly. Traditional institutions can be depicted not only as unequal and oppressive, but also as pathological, requiring the social and economic therapy that only the knowledge elite is skilled enough to design and apply. The interests of the knowledge elite in managing social change happen to be entirely consistent not only with the agendas of the hard left, but also with the grievances and demands of various racial and ethnic groups that view racism and prejudice as obstacles to their own advancement. So that what we see is an alliance between the new elites and organized racial and ethnic minorities to undermine and displace the traditional institutions and beliefs of white Euro-American society, which just happen to be the power centers of older elites based on wealth, land, and status. This process of displacement or dispossession is always described as progressive, liberating, or diversifying, when in fact it merely helps consolidate the dominance of a new class and weaken the power and interests of its rivals. Furthermore, what this understanding of the real meaning of egalitarianism leads to is that when we see university deans and presidents, quote, caving in to the demands of the hard left, they are not really displaying traits of weakness and appeasement. Universities are the breeding grounds of egalitarianism and its applications to society by the elites, and hence they occupy a special and strategic place in the functioning of the system. If the ideology of egalitarianism were abandoned, many of the functions that universities now perform in the way of research and much of what their faculties do in designing egalitarian social programs and therapy would become obsolete. When the universities cave in to the left, therefore, they are simply, and in reality, pursuing their own interests, which are to preserve the political ideology of egalitarianism intact and suppress or silence those who dissent from it. And then they are, in that respect, in fact, behaving like any elite, like the French aristocracy of the 18th century, for example, when it punished Enlightenment writers who challenged aristocratic ideologies. Their behavior appears to be weak or degenerate or renegade to us because we look at their conduct from the point of view of those who believe the consequences of egalitarianism are harmful and have to live with those consequences. And also because most of us continue to harbor the illusion that the elites that now prevail in this country and much of the West are still in some sense our elites, that they represent us, when in fact they mainly represent themselves and their class interests and the ideology and agendas that serve those interests. I think understanding egalitarianism today as the ideology of a dominant elite that uses it to serve its own interests may suggest ways in which we could more successfully confront the ideology and those it serves. In the past, most of those who have challenged egalitarianism in one form or another have done so through what we might call rationalistic means. That is, they have tried to cite scientific or empirical evidence logically assembled to offer the challenge. Certainly that is an important and indeed crucial element of the challenge. But whatever its rational and scientific merits, it has not been enough. As Pearson points out, none of Levin's critics, and not many of Rushton's either, was interested in debating their ideas or dealing with their scientific validity. Of course not. What their critics were interested in was power and in preventing Rushton, Levin, and others from challenging that power. And that is exactly the point at which they should be attacked and exposed. What we need to do, in addition to building the scientific and scholarly case against egalitarianism and environmentalism, is to take a page from the book of the left, to expose those who resist scientific evidence and who respond to it only with lies and repression as the beneficiaries of the egalitarian ideology they are trying to protect. We need to show that an entire political and economic industry gains wealth and power from egalitarian environmental ideology, and in a word, unmask or deconstruct those interests. And we need in particular to show how Americans, as taxpayers, as crime victims, as job and college applicants, and frankly simply as white people, are being exploited and victimized by the lie of equality and the power structure that rests on it. We need to show also how the media conglomerates, which with universities are sort of the belly of the beast of the new knowledge elite, systematically depict whites in their traditional cultural symbols in inferior, demeaning, and villainous roles, and how they deliberately distort news about race and scientific racial research against whites. One example of this comes from the crusade against Bob Grant in New York, which was largely conducted by a group that calls itself FAIR, for fairness and accuracy in reporting. FAIR poses as a watchdog of the press, but the quickest glance at the materials it produces shows that it is in fact a hard-left political battery dedicated to ridding the media of anyone to the right of Tom Brokaw. It has produced dossiers on Rush Limbaugh to prove he is not a reliable source of information, and has produced a similar document on Pat Buchanan to document his racism and extremism. But I am unable to identify any such dossier produced by FAIR on any liberal or left-wing commentator. One of its abiding bugaboos is the corporate concentration of media ownership, and it loves to thump its chest about its passion to invigorate the First Amendment by advocating for greater plurality and diversity in the media and defending working journalists when they are muzzled. As a working journalist who was muzzled, I might have made use of FAIR's talents, but for some reason they have not knocked on my door. But Mr. Grant did hear from them. On March 31st of this year, FAIR ran a quarter-page ad on the op-ed page of the Sunday New York Times in the form of an open letter to Michael Eisner of the Walt Disney Company, which was the new corporate parent of Mr. Grant's station. The ad claimed that Mr. Grant on his program had promoted, quote, the white supremacist American Renaissance Conference in Louisville, and unquote, and demanded of Mr. Eisner, is it the policy of the Walt Disney Company to allow hosts on its stations to make racial slurs? And is it Disney's policy to allow the promotion of white supremacist groups on its stations? Though FAIR did not explicitly demand Grant's firing, it was clear that was the goal it had in mind. So much for invigorating the First Amendment. I will comment only briefly on the falsity of the description of American Renaissance in this conference, let alone me as white supremacist, a term none of us has ever applied to ourselves and one which we have explicitly, publicly, and repeatedly rejected. FAIR did not bother to cite any of several published letters by me in major newspapers rejecting this term. Now, not only is FAIR neither fair nor accurate in what it jokingly calls its reporting, but also it managed to reach all the way out into the boondocks of Louisville to induce reporter David Heath of the Louisville Courier to swallow its bait and then regurgitate it in the form of, quote, news articles here. Articles that are transparently inaccurate and equally transparently based on FAIR's propaganda. It turns out that while FAIR whines and grouses about corporate concentration of media ownership, and I substantially agree with them on much of that, FAIR actually receives a good deal of its own cash from such concentrations of mega money as the MacArthur Foundation and the Turner Foundation in Atlanta, the tax-exempt preserve of multimillionaire media czar Ted Turner and his wife, the famous North Vietnamese patriot. As well as from Barbara Streisand's foundation. And while poor little old Fair is whining about concentration of media ownership, it's interesting to note that it was in the Louisville Courier, owned by the Gannett chain, that it was able to get its unfair and inaccurate misreporting into print, and also that Bob Grant's job was largely safe as long as his station was owned by the relatively small ABC Capital Cities Company, but went down the drain pipe not long after Eisner World took it over. FAIR is in fact dependent on large sums of cash from tax-exempt foundations run by wealthy leftists and assorted bubbleheads, and its claims to resist media concentration, to champion muzzled reporters, and to invigorate the First Amendment and freedom of expression are all simply lies that mask its real role as a tool of the real elites that have come to power in this country. Finally, in addition to unmasking the real role of egalitarianism as a device of power, we need to take yet another page from the book of the left in mustering the courage to stand up and speak up for what we believe in, to develop the kind of solidarity against which lies and repression cannot stand. We do not yet have that kind of solidarity, and the result is that we are picked off one by one whenever the left or its allies decide to move against us. It is fairly commonplace for those of us who speak and write frankly about race and equality to encounter audiences where the criticism and hostility of a handful are triumphant, only to find after the speech that we are approached privately by many sympathizers who have sat silent throughout the whole proceeding and said nothing, but who now rush to our side to assure us that they really agree with us, only they just can't run the risk of saying so. How sweet. I and Jared Taylor and Phil Rushton and Michael Levin and the others are supposed to run the gauntlet, risk our own jobs and even our physical security, while others secretly and silently and safely applaud. If you agree with the ideas you have heard at this conference, in which you read in American Renaissance, or in my columns, or in the books by the distinguished authors who have come here, and if you believe those ideas are important, then you and all of us are going to have to do something yourself. You're going to have to run risks and take hits, not recklessly, but with prudence. If we are not prepared to accept some risks and take some hits, then these ideas will never go anywhere. And those on the left who have the courage to work and fight for their beliefs are going to win. We all know what their victory would mean. And until we are willing to display the kind of courage that civil rights workers in the South showed, that anti-war protesters in the 1960s showed, that indeed gay rights activists have shown, until we are willing to risk some of our security and advantages for what we believe in and for what we believe is fundamental for the survival of our civilization and our people, then we will have no reason for optimism and every reason to expect the victory of our enemies and their lies. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Later today, a discussion about public policy toward the family and the court's role in family issues. That's tonight.